Dr. Ray. I have to say that this today's event is sponsored with the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology, and I owe a lot to Dr. Ray for collaborating with the Baha'i Chair for us to be able to hold these symposia and lectures on the theme of structural racism and the root causes of prejudice. I don't want to take too much time because we have two very distinguished speakers with us today, and I'd like to welcome both of them, Drs. Noguera and Dr. Johnson. Thank you for being here with us today. I wanted to also thank our BSOS, standing for the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, BSOS ambassadors. There are 3 here who always help us organize, arrange, and just make these events run better. And today they are Sega Shifera, Dorian Gano, Azachi Okorankuo. Thank you so much for being here and helping us out today. Today's symposium, as you know, is a part of an ongoing series of programs. We are now in our 2nd year and the 5th symposium or lecture, either one. And these have been extremely important in terms of the scholarship that are presented at these events in terms of what we're learning about structural racism, because it is one of the major barriers to making the world a better place, racism is. And it also, racism is, the scourge of racism actually makes it very difficult to live in a better world. So to understand it and to try to figure out how to get rid of it becomes extremely important for all of us. So I would like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Pedro Noguera. Whatever I tell you will not be enough, and you need to just go online and read about what he has accomplished. But I will tell you this, that he is the Peter L. Agnew Professor of Education at New York University. He holds tenured faculty appointments in the departments of Teaching and Learning and Humanities and Social Sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Development at the New York University. He is also the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and Transformation of Schools. Dr. Noguera has been in the field of education for over 30 years. He has been a public school teacher in Providence, Rhode Island, and Oakland, California, and elected school board member in Berkeley, California, a professor and researcher at the University of California, Berkeley, Harvard, and now New York University. In describing his views on education, Dr. Noguera explains, and I'd like to quote him, "The roles I have occupied in the field of education have profoundly shaped my outlook and led me to adopt positions that are often less partisan or ideological than those typically espoused on either side of the highly contentious debates that characterize education today." Said truly by a scholar. And so I could tell you a lot more about Dr. Noguera. He has received many, many awards. He has published 8 books, over 150 articles, but I will leave that to you to go online and see what this man has accomplished. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Dr. Pedro Noguera.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Mahmoudi, first of all, and the Baha'i Center, or the chair, for this invitation. I've actually been a regular visitor to this campus, and so it's good to be back once again. For those of you not familiar with the Baha'i faith, I would say, if there's any religion, I was just saying earlier today, I think that religion is actually the source of a lot of the world's problems today, because many of the wars today are driven by religious zealots. But Baha'i is not one of them. Baha'i is generally a people that you find associated with peace and tolerance and respect for difference. And so it's a real privilege to be invited and by the Baha'i Chair. I also want to thank Professor Ray for opening up your classroom and just say it's an honor to get to speak to your students and all the other guests who've come this afternoon. So I'm going to do this as quickly as possible because I don't want to take any time away from Professor Johnson. And so that means that, like, unfortunately, many New Yorkers, I'll be fast in my talking. So let me start by saying this, that education and civil rights continue to be linked, both in the expressions we hear from policymakers, everyone from President Obama to just about every candidate for president, governor, Congress, dog catcher. Right? They all like to say that education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century. They never then say what that means and who they're fighting with to secure those rights, but everyone associates these two. And on top of that, we know historically that's been the truth. Right? That is that a key part of securing rights has been through education. In fact, you could trace this country's history and the expansion of democracy and of rights through the experience of education. Right? Because as we have opened up access to education, we've been forced to also recognize the rights of people, even those who have not been citizens. Our public schools are by far the most accessible institution in the country today. The only institution that accepts all children regardless of their background, including the undocumented, and the courts have ruled repeatedly that undocumented children have rights to an education in this country. At the same time, we provide an education that is profoundly unequal, that corresponds not only to where you live and how much we spend to educate children, but also who you are. So I want to start by tracing that history a bit because I think it is important for an institution that's played such a critical role in this country's democracy to understand both why this role is so important and what the future holds, given the nature of inequality in America today. An inequality that the Pope, the President, and numerous others have recognized as being really the source of great trouble ahead. Even yesterday, Jeb Bush spoke to inequality as the great threat to this country. So I want to start by saying this country's always looked to its public schools, first and foremost, to integrate and assimilate immigrants. Because it is through education that we thought that we could turn them into citizens, that we would not just teach English, but also teach what it meant to be an American. In fact, we called many of our early schools Americanization schools, those that served immigrants. And whether the immigrants came from Europe or from Asia or from Latin America or Africa, we always turned to the schools to do that work. And I would say, in contrast to many European countries, we've done it far more effectively. Right? That is that generation after being in this country, people start to think of themselves as American. Right? And that's certainly not the case if you were Denmark or France or many other parts of Europe. At the same time, it's always been the case that the price of mobility through education has been assimilation. That is that if you wanted, in fact, to experience opportunity in this country, you had to give up your language and, in many cases, your culture. And that trade-off is one that I think many immigrants continue to struggle with because it poses huge challenges, not just for identity, but for connections to family. In addition, we have historically looked to schools to solve some of our most pressing social and political problems, namely racial segregation. And racial segregation, as this picture shows, took federal troops to actually uproot because it was not merely a social system, but it was a cultural system that was deeply embedded throughout this country. We are most familiar with the story in the South, and if you saw Selma, the movie recently, reminded of how bitter and violent that struggle was. But many of us who know the history of the world around long enough to have been part of it know that the struggle in the North was just as bad. That there was blood on the streets of Boston, for example, when attempts were made to desegregate the schools. And it's not surprising that the NAACP, and at the time led by Thurgood Marshall, focused on ending segregation as the key to expanding rights for African Americans in this country because it was understood that education was the linchpin of the entire system of racial oppression and racial inequality. And if you could challenge that, challenged the practice of separate and profoundly unequal, because separate but equal never was in fact the practice in this country. The argument was that you could not simply get integrated schools, but as important, get schools some degree of equity in terms of how we treated children. Now, as we know, the struggle for equity, particularly in learning opportunities and even as basic as how much we spend to educate children, is an ongoing one. But it's important to think back now why 60 years after the Brown decision, that was the focus, particularly now when we still find so many segregated schools throughout America. And one of the ironies is that schools today are more segregated in places like the North and the West than they are in the South. And again, it speaks to the fact that this is largely an unfinished journey. It's often also worth pointing out that despite the fact that many of our public officials like to say education is the civil rights issue of the 21st century, there was almost silence about the Brown decision, its 60th anniversary, including from the Obama administration, which did not speak to the fact that our schools continue to be profoundly segregated on the basis of race and class. And it's the race and class dimension of it that I think is the most troubling, because not only haven't we fulfilled the goals of Brown, we haven't even gotten close to Plessy. Plessy, for those of you who know our history, know that that was the promise of separate but equal. Today we find schools are separate and profoundly unequal in almost every dimension that matters. And we also know, because of what I said earlier about schools being the most accessible institutions in the country, that the schools that are serving the poorest children are often overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed because poverty rates have grown, particularly since 2008 and the Great Recession. And they're overwhelmed because you cannot separate the learning needs of a child from their non-academic needs. Put most simply and obviously, hungry children don't do well in school. Hunger is a problem in America today. Large numbers of children who are struggling with reading have no access to eyeglasses, no provision for eyeglasses under No Child Left Behind. It's ironic because the slogan, "Leave no child behind," came from the Children's Defense Fund, headed by Man Wright Edelman, not the Bush administration. But when she came up with the term, "Leave no child behind," she had something in mind different than testing them as frequently as possible. She literally meant that in a wealthy nation, we should ensure that the health and nutrition needs of all children is being met. That's still not part of our policy in this country. And so in many schools, the only meals that children are guaranteed are the meals they get at school. I was talking to a group of principals in Michigan who described sending food home with kids on weekends because they weren't sure they would eat again until Monday. New York City, schools being forced to stay open in summer, not even for the purpose of summer school, but simply to feed children. Our public schools are all that remains of the social safety net for children in this country. The United States has second highest child poverty rate amongst advanced nations in the world. And invariably, we leave it to public schools. And invariably, public schools fail when they're overwhelmed by poverty. And our response to their failure typically is to blame them for their failure, to threaten them, to pressure them, to publish lists in the papers about which schools are failing. And almost always, if you know the race and class of the school, you can be sure which schools will be failing. But that part of the conversation, despite all this talk about civil rights, is not mentioned. That we've concentrated the neediest kids in the schools with the least funding and often with the least qualified personnel. And it's not always that case. If you go to DC public schools, they've spent a lot of money on public schools in Washington, D.C., nation's capital. I've done work there with some schools, and I would say that despite the money, they usually spend it on the wrong things. Visiting one of the high schools, I won't name it because I don't want to embarrass the people who work there or send their children there, but school with over 30 administrators in a student population of 600. And not one of them knows how to teach reading. And large numbers of kids can't read. And so the problem is not simply a lack of resources. It's bigger than that. It's more complex than that. But unfortunately, our policies and our politics prevent us from addressing the complexity. Instead, what we end up with are policies that suggest that the problem can be solved merely by threatening schools, punishing schools, or in some cases even humiliating them. State of Florida, for example, puts letter grades on schools so that everyone will know if it's a failing school. So we can go to an A school all the way down to an F school. Now, I would think that if the state of Florida puts an F on the school, the state should be sued for allowing children to go there. Because it knowingly has said this is a failing school, but is allowing children to attend. It'd be like if the university knew this building was toxic and said, have a great class. Right? You would say, no, that's not appropriate. So I visited Edison High School in Miami. It's a triple F school. And I asked the principal, how'd you get to be triple F? He says, well, you failed the state exam 3 times. I said, what happens if you fail again? He says, we will fail again because over 80% of our kids don't speak English, haven't been in the country long enough to pass an exam in English, and the state says they'll take us over if we fail again. And then I ask, are you worried about being taken over by the state? He says, not at all. I said, because the state can't take us over. There are too many schools just like us all over the state. He said, what's more, do you think the state of Florida would know what to do if they took over this school? Do you think there's some special recipe they've been holding back on that they would now make available to the children at Edison High School? The record of state takeovers, including in this state, I think Baltimore is still under some form of receivership, is abysmal. In New Jersey, every major urban district, with the exception of Elizabeth, is under state control. Ironically, in all the talk about accountability, there's no accountability on the people who actually run the state and run the schools. We have an accountability system that holds those with the least power and authority accountable, and those with the most, none at all. I'll go more about what's wrong with these policies, but the simple truth is that while we are pretending to be in the business of reforming our schools, and we've been trying to reform our schools now, some say ever since the Russians launched Sputnik, we've been trying to reform our schools, inequality is growing. Poverty is increasing. This quote here from Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, reminds us that this is truly an American problem. Only country that has greater inequality than us is China, amongst the advanced industrialized nations. And it's a threat not merely because we don't have the money to consume when we have this much inequality and people are struggling to get by. It's a threat because it also breeds instability, a point I'll come back to later. The so-called achievement gap that we've been focused on since No Child Behind, when unpacked, right, is really nothing more than a manifestation of social inequality. What do I mean by that? The strongest predictor for how well a child will do in school, the strongest predictor for how well you'll do on the SAT, for what kind of college you will go to, is family income. Family income, when combined with how much education your parents had, particularly your mother, these are the strongest predictors for how well a child will do. What that suggests is that if we were really serious about using education as a means to reduce inequality, we would do much, much more for the kids who had families that without resources and without education. Because over 50% of student achievement is influenced by what parents do. Not surprisingly, parents with more education invest more in their children, tutor their own children, help them with homework, do everything they can to provide the extra edge. I'm sure that many of you come from homes like that, where your parents, even now, are investing in you. Well, not all parents can do that. Not all parents have the means or the resources. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, we end up with a system that rather than expanding opportunity, more often than not reproduces inequity. But as Sean Reardon, an economist at Stanford, points out in this quote, if we could do that to expand inequity, we could also do the reverse with different policies. I'm going to get to that in a moment. The focus of this particular series is on structural racism. And I just want to speak to that briefly because increasingly the kind of racism we're talking about in America is not racism carried out by George Wallace or any of the other characters from our past who openly and violently defended racial barriers. It's much more complex than that today. Today we're talking about a structure that perpetuates inequities that are racialized. They're racialized in outcomes related to graduation rates and suspension rates and reading and math scores, but they're also racialized with respect to income and incarceration rates, and as we've seen with these housing foreclosures, with even who's losing their homes. That is, there's a correspondence between what's happening in school and what's happening outside of school. That shouldn't shock any of us. But in this country, we approach the problems of education in a vacuum. We pretend that we could try to create a level playing field without doing anything outside of school. And not surprisingly, we're not making much progress. All the countries that outperform the United States don't do it that way. For example, in Canada, and if you want to find the city in North America that has done more to educate children in poverty, go to Toronto, where despite their crack-smoking mayor, they have found ways to mitigate the effects of poverty and to create schools that serve poor children and immigrant children extremely well. They don't use pressure as a strategy to improve schools. They focus on capacity building in schools and smart investments in resources. It's a different strategy. And it's a strategy that extends beyond the school because in Canada they also have a healthcare system that works and a system of higher education that's not bankrupting families because they're all public and they're all affordable. So yeah, we can't maybe do what Canada does, but we should learn from Canada. And we should learn from Western Europe. We should learn from the Koreans. Korea was not where it is right now. Korea is today one of the highest performing nations in education. Korea had universal access to preschool long before it even came on the agenda in this country. Why? Because they get it. The gap in achievement doesn't begin at 5, it begins at birth. And if you don't invest in quality early childhood education, you end up with kids who come into kindergarten who are really not prepared to learn. Yes?
I think that includes North Korea, right?
Say again? Not North Korea. Not North Korea. South Korea. We often call them just Korea, as though we forget the North, but that's a whole other story. Disparities are widening right now in wealth, in health disparities. We're seeing in the criminal justice system, and of course, we're seeing in education. I don't have the time to give you the statistics, but the gaps in black-white wealth are in some ways the most startling and shocking. Because right now, that we have disparities in wealth, and I'm talking by wealth, we're not just looking at income, we're talking about net assets of households that parallel those of South Africa under apartheid. That's what the current data shows. And that goes beyond, as I said, the Latino population now, the fastest growing, huge gaps there. So this is not merely a black-white issue. Right? And when you consider the fact that this country is so rapidly changing, right now, the majority of children in our public schools are children of color. That's our future. If we don't invest in those children, our future is in peril. Right now, you're going to see in the debate about the reauthorization of the Elementary, Secondary, and Education Act, also known as No Child Left Behind, before the Senate, an attempt to try to change the funding formula, which would move funds from the federal government away from directing their resources at poor schools and communities to a different kind of formula. And so we have to be very aware of the fact that policy not only has failed, but policy can also make the situation worse than it is now. Just recently, we've drawn attention to the high rates of suspension and the racial disparities in suspension. And the fact that obviously when kids are not in school, they can't learn. And that many of the kids that are being put out of school are not being put out of school for weapons and serious violations, they're being put out for minor offenses. as early as kindergarten. This is the Justice Department's report. And the reason why Attorney General Eric Holder described it as a civil rights violation is because it's happening rampantly across the country and without much in the way of response. What's important, again, to keep in mind, it's happening right here in Prince George's County. And in many of the schools where it's happening, the principals are African American. And so we cannot simply say, well, this is racism as we once knew it. This is, as my friend Edward Bonilla Silva says, racism without racist. Right? That is, the people who are making these decisions, they would tell you they are genuinely not racist, and I believe it. But they take absolutely no responsibility for the disparate impact of their actions and of their policies. And it is being aware of those disparities and addressing them that I think is the key. How am I doing for time? I got 5 minutes. So I'm not going to be able to talk about what we should do too much. But
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. So let me go real fast. We've been focused a lot on the achievement gap, I would say, and a number of people have said, including the Schott Foundation, many others, what we should be focused on is the opportunity gap. Right? And the opportunity gap, if we focus on that, then really gets us and ask different questions. Not just who's achieving, who's not, but have they had the opportunity to learn? Are their needs being met? Do they have access to teachers that can actually teach them and courses that they're going to need to be prepared for college? If we were to focus on those simple things, we would have a different strategy. I would say beyond that, we need to acknowledge that poverty is a major issue. Right? This quote, I won't have time to read, comes from the former chancellor of New York City Public Schools, who says poverty is not the problem. Right? Real problem is lazy teachers. That was the Michelle Rhee argument in Washington, D.C. Lazy teachers, just fire bad teachers, you'll solve the problem. Again, we get simplistic solutions to complex problems. What happens? The problems don't go away. So what I would suggest is that we ask different kinds of questions. Instead of asking how to simply raise achievement, we should ask, under what conditions can schools mitigate the effects of poverty and have a positive impact on the communities and children they serve? Because here's the truth. Poverty is not a learning disability. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you can't learn. However, poverty ignored can be disabling. And so the question is, can we respond to the needs of children and at the same time provide high quality, challenging, stimulating education? I think we can. And what does that education then look like? So one of the things that it looks like is this. Got a whole lot of attention in Harlem from the Harlem Children's Zone. Why? Because Jeffrey Canada figured out a while ago that you've got to not only address quality education, you've got to address health and nutrition and early childhood education and parent education. You've got to feed the kids. You've got to give them summer learning opportunities. Now, Jeffrey Canada is a very ambitious, resourceful guy, and he's been able to raise a ton of money from hedge funds and from Goldman Sachs. So the question is this replicable? Right? And to a large degree, it's not. However, there are places like the Children's Aid Society and many other communities now across the country that are trying to figure out how do we build together support systems in our communities so that schools are not expected to do this work alone. And I could describe some of this work occurring and what we're learning from it. Other thing we know is that today, and many of you are living proof of it, the choice is not work or college. Many of you are, how many of you are working while you're in college? Look around the room, okay? And working your way through college, right? But now the question is, how many of you are getting skills that could be useful to you when you graduate? I want to ask someone. Right? This is a huge issue, right? When I was in the Bay Area, I helped to set up a biotech academy that's now 22 years old. Kids graduate from that biotech academy, walk into jobs paying $16 an hour. We said, that's not good enough. Let's make it a career path so that we have a partnership with community colleges and four-year colleges. Some of the kids finish the course of study and decide they don't want to do biotech. Guess what? That gives them the option to do whatever they want because they've done 4 years of science and 4 years of math. And so it doesn't close options, it expands options. There's a new way to do vocational education that will open doors rather than shut them down. There are other promising models, renewable energy project at Central High School, small business projects in Providence, Rhode Island. I could go on and on. What they have in common is links to industry, real critical and creative thinking about what preparation needs to look like in secondary schools. There's also a number of schools now that are trying to do assessment differently. That is, rather than using standardized tests as a weapon to threaten kids and threaten teachers, say, no, let's use performance-based assessment so that we actually have evidence that kids can write and read and do research. And the schools that are doing this are getting kids better prepared for college than the schools relying on traditional test scores. They're getting better results because they're focused on authentic assessments of what kids can actually do. And in those schools, you don't just turn in the work and get a grade. Every time you turn in work, it is revise and resubmit. Revise and resubmit because the focus is on mastery, not merely completing the assignment. And if you want kids to understand the importance of striving for their best, do that. If Professor Ray were to say from now on, if this work comes below a B, you're going to have to do it over again until it gets to the level I think is acceptable for a student at the University of Maryland, College Park. It would be a different day, wouldn't it? Be a whole lot of revision. But guess what? Most of us don't do. How many of you do your best work the first time? Glad to see that. I want to see it too. What these schools are doing are focusing much more on engagement. Engagement. That is, rather than merely focusing on achievement, they are focusing on how do we get kids excited about learning? How do we use things like music and interaction to get kids to take more ownership for learning? Look at this classroom. This is a classroom in East Los Angeles. It's a math class that lasts 90 minutes, and the kids are up out of their seats. And you know what's happening there? They're learning from each other. They're working together. They're problem solving. And because they know how to do that, they also know how to work in groups. They know how to do developing the kind of social skills they're going to need later on in life. Schools like these are showing us there's another way. This is a program in Sacramento that's using spoken word to produce kids who are excellent writers, because they say kids who can write poetry can also learn to write essays and can do op-eds and they can do all kinds of writing, because the key is to get them writing and to cultivate that desire to express themselves. This is a school in the Eastern Cape of South Africa where, despite intense poverty, 80% unemployment rates, over 50% of the kids orphans due to AIDS. This school has over 80 parents a day who volunteer at the school, who do everything from work a garden to make sure kids are fed, staff a medical clinic, clean classrooms, do home visits. Over and over again, I could ask these parents, why do you do this? Do you get paid? And they said, our kids are here. The principal who's standing in the back of the room was wise enough to realize he couldn't wait for the Ministry of Education to help him. He had to get help from the parents he serves. And now the parents are organized to support the school, and the school is a vibrant community. I'm running out of time. All I would say is we need a different approach, a more holistic strategy than we've seen, a strategy that keeps teaching and learning at the center, but also addresses health, nutrition, safety, engages families, treats communities and schools like assets. Right? There's a different way to do this than we have. That model exists in isolated parts of the country right now. We need to learn from those models and stop pretending this is something that's so far out of reach it can't be done. Thank you.